Okay, lesson 5.1b is on converting fractions to decimals. So you will need pages 8, 9, and 10. However, you can do your notes on a piece of paper. So in number 1, it says, what fraction of the candy bar is shaded in? So you have a bar model, or they call this a candy bar, that's broken into 10 parts. In this case, there are 3 gray regions. So there are 3 parts out of the total of 10 parts that are shaded in. So what fraction would be shaded in? There would be 3 out of 10. So your fraction is 3/10. Okay, so how you say the fraction out loud, you would say it's 3/10. And notice how we learned about place value in the last lesson. So 3/10 as a decimal, you would write 0 as your place value, as your placeholder, and then you'd write your decimal, and then you'd write 3 right after the decimal point, because the number right after the decimal point is the 10th place. Okay. In number 2, it's asking you what fraction of the candy bar is shaded. So count how many parts are shaded in. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 parts that are shaded in out of a total of 10 parts. So that means we have 7 out of 10 parts that are shaded in. So how you would say this fraction out loud, this would be 7/10. Then as a decimal, you'd have 0 as a placeholder, your decimal point, and then 7, which is right after the decimal point, because that's your 10th place. Okay, so let's take a look at example number 3. So to the left, there's a 10 by 10 grid. Why do you think it's called a 10 by 10 grid? So if you look at the grid, there are 10 units across, and there are 10 units down. Okay, so each of the going downwards, there's 10 units in each row, and then going across, there's 10 units in each column. So that means that we have a 10 by 10 grid. Okay, so it's 10 units across and 10 units down. Okay, now if it's a 10 by 10 grid, that means we have a total of 100 units. Okay, so it says, how would you use the 10 by 10 grid to show a fraction of 6/100 or 6 out of 100? So if there's a total of 100 units or 100 little squares, that means we would want to shade in only 6 out of the 100 squares. So shade in 6 out of the 100 squares. Okay, so go ahead and try that. Shade in 6 squares. Okay, so it should look something like what you see in the drawing in number 3. Okay, number 4a, what fraction is shown in the 10 by 10 grid? So look at how many of the squares are shaded in. You can count one by one, but notice if it's a 10 by 10 grid, that each row has 10 squares. So this row has 10, this first row has 10, the second row has 10, and the third row has 10, or column. So that means so far we have 10 plus 10 plus 10, that would be 30. And then we can count the individual units in the last column. So it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that means there are 36 units shaded in. So that means we have 36 out of 100 out of 100 units that are shaded. So our fraction would be 36 out of 100. Okay. So what is the decimal equivalent for this fraction? Remember that the hundredths place means that your denominator is 100. So the 100 here tells us that this would be in the hundredths place. So this would be, you can write 0 point, your decimal point, and then 36 hundredths. So your 6 should end in the hundredths place. Okay. So next problem, number 5. Go ahead and try this on your own, then pause the video, then resume the video once you are done. So on this 10 by 10 grid, there are 10 units shaded down in the first column, and there's 10 units shaded down in the second column. So that means we have a total of 20 out of 100 units shaded in. And remember that 100 means that our value is in the hundredths place. So this would be 0.20. So it'd be 20 hundredths. That's how you would read that. Okay, so for number 6, now we're going to grade or shade the decimal that's given to us. So here we have 0.27. Remember that you read this as 27 hundredths. So that means we're going to shade in 27 out of 100 of the units. So go ahead and try that. So shade in 27 of these squares. So you should have 27 units shaded in for letter A. For letter B, this is 4 tenths. Oops, I spelled tenths wrong. Okay, so remember that 4 tenths means 4 out of 10. Since we have 100 units in this grid, we want to see how much 4 tenths would be out of the 100 instead of 10. So since 10 times 10 is 100, we multiply 4 times 10 and we get 40 hundredths, or 40 out of 100. So that means you want to shade in 40 out of the 100 units. Or also you can think, if I want to shade in 4 tenths, I want to shade in 4 rows of 10. So go ahead and try that. So notice how I shaded in 4 rows of 10 or 40 units in my drawing. Okay, letter C, you want to represent 35 hundredths. So remember that 35 hundredths means 35 out of 100 squares. So you want to shade in 35 of the squares. So go ahead and try that as well. So you should have 35 units or squares shaded in out of the total of 100 squares. So that would be 35 hundredths, or 35 out of 100 in a fraction. So next we have D, 125 thousandths. So remember that as a fraction, you write this as 125 out of 1,000. So we don't have 1,000 squares, we only have 100 squares. So that means what we want to do is figure out what would 125 thousandths be out of 100 squares. So 1,000, if you divide 1,000 by 10, that gives us 100. So you want to divide 125 by 10, and that would be 12.5 out of 100. So that means you want to shade in 12.5 squares. So you can shade 10 down in the first column. Then in the second column, you can shade 2 more, so that'd be 12. And then a half of one of your unit squares. So that shows 12.5 out of 100. So that would be 125 thousandths. Okay. So now for the next one, it says write the fraction equivalent for each decimal in simplest form here. So for A, we found it was 27 out of 100. So you'd write 27 out of 100, which can't be reduced. So just make sure that if you can reduce it, go ahead and do so. If not, just leave it as it is. So in part B, we got 4/10. So that was 4 out of 10, which if we reduce it, we can divide by 2, and we get 2/5. Okay, letter C, we got 35 hundredths, or 35 out of 100, which if we reduce that, we can divide by 5. So 35 divided by 5 is 7. 100 divided by 5 is 20. So we get 7/20ths. Now 125 thousandths would be our fraction for part D. However, we don't want to divide by 10 because we really don't want to have a decimal and a fraction mixed. So we only did that method in order to figure out how many out of the 100 squares we were going to shade in. But in reality, when we divide, we're not going to do that. So 125 and 1,000, you can actually divide the numerator and denominator by 125, and you're going to get 1/8 as your fraction. Okay, so we're going to get 1/8. Okay, on 7 through 12, you're going to convert each fraction to a decimal using long division. So some steps to do that is you're going to divide the numerator by the denominator. Okay, so if I have 1/4, 1 would be your numerator, and 4 is the denominator. So you would want to divide 1 by 4. Since 4 doesn't go in a 1 evenly, you add a decimal point, carry it up add a 0. Now 4 goes into 10 twice. 2 times 4 is 8. You subtract 8 from 10, you get a remainder of 2. Add another 0, bring it down. 4 goes into 25 times. 5 times 4 is 20. So that means that 1/4 is going to equal 0.25. Okay, next we have 1/10. So you can divide 1 by 10. 10 doesn't go in a 1. So add a decimal point, add a 0. 10 goes into 10 once. 1 times 10 is 10. So that means that 1/10 is equivalent to 0.1 or 1/10, which is 0.1. I'm going to add a 0 in front of the decimal as a placeholder. So that would be 1/10. Okay, 1 out of 100. You can divide 1 by 100. 100 doesn't go into 1 evenly, so add a decimal point, add a 0. 100 goes into 10 0 times. 0 times 100 is 0. So you have a remainder of 10. You can add another 0, bring it down. 100 goes into 100 once, and 1 times 100 is 100. So that means that 1 over 100 or 1/100th would be 0.01, or we read that as 100th. So if you know how to read 100th, you can easily write it as a decimal. Now 1/8, divide 1 by 8. 8 doesn't go into 1 evenly, so add a decimal point, add a 0. 8 goes into 10 once. 1 times 8 is 8. Subtract 8 from 10, you get a remainder of 2. Add another 0, bring it down. 8 goes into 20 twice. 2 times 8 would be 16. Your remainder of 4. Add a 0, bring it down. 8 goes into 45 times. 5 times 8 is 40. So that means 1/8 is equivalent to 0.125, or you can add 0 as a placeholder. So it'd be 0.125, which is 125 thousandths. Okay, number 11. Divide 1 by 3. 3 doesn't go into 1 evenly, so add a decimal point, add a 0. 3 goes into 10 3 times. 3 times 3 is 9. Subtract 9 from 10, you get a remainder of 1. Add a 0, bring it down. 3 goes into 10 3 times again. So 3 times 3 is 9. Remainder of 1, keep going. And notice how it's just going to keep repeating. So that means that 1/3 is 0.3 repeating. What you do is you write 0.3 and then you put a line over the 3 that indicates that it's a repeating decimal, so the 3 is going to keep going on forever. So just make sure that you have that line over the 3. Okay, number 12, 3/5. Divide 3 by 5. 5 doesn't go into 3 evenly, so add a decimal point, add a 0. 5 goes into 36 times. 5 times 6 is 30. So 30 minus 30 is 0. So that means that 3/5 is 0.6. You can write it as 0.6. And that's it. So 3/5 would be equivalent to 6/10. So this concludes lesson 5.1b.